to welcome back all the people who have been listening to this series, and also especially to welcome any of you who may be tuning in for the first time. We've designed these talks to be conversations in a way, so we want to help get you involved a little later on. And I want to thank especially Father Dan for joining us here, and he and I will present, but we'll also maybe engage in a little bit of conversation as well. In this session, we're going to present Francis and Clare. And Francis and Clare are a perfect example of what I call mystical conversation. That is two important mystics, a man and woman who were related and had a certain influence on each other, influenced each other's religious life and religious thought. And there are many examples of these in the history of Christianity. We can think, of course, of Teresa and John of the Cross. You can think of Francis de Sales and Jane de Chantal. You can think of Henry Suso and the Dominican nun Elspeth Stagel and the like. So the mystical conversations, I think, are a distinctive aspect of Christian mysticism. And so we'll try to talk to some extent about both of them. Obviously, be somewhat more to say about Francis, because we really can't give equal attention to both figures. But I think it is important to recognize that in a way they belong to each other. They mutually illuminate each other. They had certainly, an effect on each other's lives. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So what I'd like to do here in terms of what I'm going to present is talk a little bit about Francis's life and illustrate that with regard to a few quotations that I culled from different texts by and about Francis that I think illustrate some of the major kinds of themes. Then I want to give a general characterization of his theology under the headings of what I call vernacular mysticism, and also a kind of archaic theology of mysticism, which is not my phrase. Phrase that was created by a fine French friar, scholar of mysticism, Tadej Madura. And then I want to look at one or two texts, specifically the text of the Canticle of Brother Sun, and then maybe a little bit about the Testament. So that's where we're going. So Francis is born 1181, as you may know, in the town of Assisi in Umbria, in an era that was an era of change in the medieval period, and especially in Italy. Time of change in the church. There were many challenges to the church, both in terms of the growth of heresies. There was a increasing bureaucratization in the church, certainly, and the papacy. There's also a time of ferment in religious life, with many new religious ideas and being formed and religious groups being formed, of which Francis's followers, the Fraternitas, is going to be one. And many of these groups followed the star of the notion of apostolic poverty, evangelical poverty. They felt that the religious life of the, especially of the monastics and others, was too opulent, too socially important. They wanted to be poor like Christ and the first disciples, and they wanted to preach the gospel in poverty. But Francis didn't start out as a religious figure. He started out as a person from, the bourgeoisie, as we would describe it today, and a young man who really didn't have much of he wanted to be a knight, he wanted to be somebody important, etc. And it's only, after the year 1200, that he began to sense there was something else to life besides his desires to be somebody important in society, to be a questing knight and to be and the like. So he underwent a kind of conversion experience sometime around 1205 and 1206, in which he gradually came to the realization that the most important thing in life was to follow Christ, and to follow Christ in the way in which Christ had lived. and Christ's first disciples, that is to follow him in poverty and also in service. This is what's so crucial, service to the poor and the outcasts. And in that sense, of course, and I'll say a little bit more about that, we have Francis's many stories and also his own words about the effect that serving lepers had on him, because lepers were the outcasts of society. And he says he just had tremendous fear of lepers and hatred for lepers until God brought him among them. And he recognized that in them and in serving them, he could see Christ. So it's not only kind of giving up the wealth of his family, but in service to the outcasts of society and in trying to live the gospel life of poverty, that Francis experiences a tremendous change in his life. At first, he does it, very much by himself, under the inspiration, we would say, a divine kind of inspiration. But he begins to attract followers from about 1205 or 1206 on. First of all, individuals from his town who say, I'm really inspired by the way in which you are living, and I'd like to accompany you on your path and on your journey. So this is the start of what is called the fraternitas, the brotherhood. Francis didn't set out to found a religious order. He set out with his first followers to be brothers in the service of the Lord in terms of that apostolic poverty, that service to the poor, and especially to the outcasts of society. So, sorry about that. And we have some interesting texts that talk about this. I'm just going to read one or two. The so-called Legend of the Three Companions has a phrase, and this describes around the year 1206 or so. It says, by divine inspiration, he began to live as one who proclaims evangelical perfection and to preach penance in a simple way in public. So evangelical perfection, preaching penance with tremendous simplicity. And gradually he attracts more and more people, including women, of whom the first example is, of course, Clare, who was from his own city, a few years younger than Francis, from a higher level in society. She was from a noble family, but she too is inspired by evangelical perfection. And sometime around the year 1211 or 1212, she's in conversation with Francis. I mean, this is something that her family, of course, would not have approved of. And she eventually steals away, and it's a Palm Sunday, steals away from her family home, goes down to meet Francis and his first brothers. Francis, in a rather unusual fashion, because he's not a priest, he accepts her into the religious life and tonsures her, and then makes arrangements for her to go live with some local nuns. And she herself also begins to attract followers. So from an early time on, and Clare always paid attention to that in her later life and in her later writings, Francis was her model for how to live the evangelical life. And strangely enough, around the year 1209 or 1210, Francis and his first followers, the early brothers, they go to Rome, and they meet the Pope, great Pope of the period, Innocent III. And they say, we'd like you to approve of our life. And again, great surprise, Innocent blesses their life. There's no real rule at this stage, but there's a series of texts taken from the Gospels, which Innocent approves and gives them a kind of permission to go around, not so much preaching by doctrinal preaching, but preaching by example and encouraging penance and poverty. So that this fraternitas is growing, and it keeps growing very, very widely. And within a few years, they're like 5,000 followers when they first get together and meet with Francis, the so-called chapter of mats, where they're all poor people laying out their mats, listening to Francis and the like. So this is, I think, much more than Francis himself had ever anticipated. But he recognizes, we would say today, it's a movement of the spirit. and it's also a movement that has received an approbation from the Pope.